Again, my name is Jessie Fairbanks. I'm the program manager here at Doc NYC, and it is my very great pleasure to kick off the Q&A for Capital in the 21st Century. I was remiss in mentioning at the beginning of this that this is the North American premiere for Justin Pemberton's film, so you are the very first audience in North America to see this. Please welcome back to the stage Justin Pemberton, the director of the film. You can go ahead and take a seat. And we have a very special guest that's going to be moderating this discussion. She is the producer and co-host of Documentary Now. Please welcome to the stage Nermeen Shaikh. So Nermeen will be guiding the discussion, and the panelists that are participating in addition to Nermeen and to Justin is Rana Foroohar. She is a global economic analyst for CNN and the author of the book Makers and Takers and Don't Be Evil. Please welcome to the stage Rana. Hi, Rana. We also have Gillian Lett, who is the chair of the editorial board the chair of the financial board in the U.S. of the Financial Times of London. Please welcome to the stage, Gillian. Jillian is not coming. Okay. Next we have Suresh Naidu. Please welcome to the stage Naresh. Hi, Naresh. Naresh is a professor of international and public affairs and economics at Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us, Suresh. And these are your panelists, and now you're going to have an amazing discussion. Please enjoy.
Well, thank you all for joining us for the film. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to moderate this panel. I'd like to begin by reading out a statement by Thomas Piketty, who is, of course, the author of the book. He writes, "I love movies. In Paris, I walk and go to movie theaters all the time, at least twice a week, all movies. So when Justin came with this project, I thought this was a wonderful way to reach a broader and different audience, and most importantly, to use a different language to talk about capital in the 21st century. I believe in the language of the social sciences, but I also believe that it's insufficient and that it needs to be complemented with the language of novels, cartoons, popular culture, art. Now, let me be clear that I did not become a filmmaker. I'm a writer and social scientist. But the film makes, I believe, a great addition to the book, and I'm grateful to Justin and the entire team for bringing it to the screen." So that's a statement from Thomas Piketty. And I'd like to begin by asking Justin, in fact, I mean, the film is quite striking because it draws on all these popular forms. There's from Grapes of Wrath to The Simpsons and so on. So what prompted you to make a film on this best-selling book, and why this form?
I think I was as surprised, and actually Thomas was as surprised, I think, as all of us, with the success of his book. And I think that in itself made us start to think, well, could this be a film? The producer, Matthew Metcalf, started talking to Thomas first about it, and Thomas was interested in telling the story in a more accessible way, perhaps, for people who wouldn't read the book, because the book is written as an economic textbook, and he's proving his formulas, and a lot of the book is theory. But when you read the book, he starts by telling these great stories about Jane Austen, or about, a mine in South Africa where workers were shot by police, and that sort of sense of story that he brought to it made me start to think more and more about the stories of capital through time. And I thought, I've never seen a film that's followed the journey of wealth through time and looked at the implications and what could be next, and also showed that progress is not necessarily good for everyone, and the progress of capital.
And what about the form, the cartoons and the
well, I like
TV
that.
shows, films?
They were, look, to be fair, the music, the movies, all that stuff was stuff that I liked, the stuff that connected with me, and I did want to make something that I wanted to watch, ultimately. That was one of the big things. And so I wrote it, developed his book as a movie and sent it to him, and he really liked it too. And when we met, he told me, at that point, his favourite film was Snowpiercer. So I thought, okay,
There's no way you could bring that into the film, though.
No.
So, and minor correction before we go ahead. I'm actually a co-host and producer at Democracy Now!, not Documentary Now!, although that sounds quite appealing too. Rana, you're interviewed at some length in the film. So if you could talk about what you think the effects have been of the financialization of the economy and what that's done to produce capitalism in its present form and all of the inequalities that the film and, of course, the book are about.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say fantastic job to Justin. Really enjoyed watching this. And as somebody that read all of Piketty's book, really nice to have this hour-and-a-half version of that for the mass population. So to go to your question, what we're looking at in this film is spoken about in different ways in the mass media. The whole idea of globalization over the last 4 or 5 decades, basically since the 1980s, is about a certain kind of capitalism. It's about a kind of a neoliberal economic ethos that allows capital to fly 35,000 feet over nation states, as I was saying in the film. That's not how it was supposed to work. Globalization was supposed to be about the free movement of capital, goods, and people. But it's much, much easier, as it turns out, for capital to move than either goods and certainly than people. So that preferences capital in all of the ways that you're seeing. And it's interesting. I looked particularly at the financial sector in my first book, Makers and Takers, but my new book, which actually just came out on Tuesday, is looking at the tech sector, which is in some ways the apex of this trend. Because if you think about the way in which capital can travel above national concerns, data and intellectual property can travel even faster and more widely. And so you look at a firm like Facebook, for example, and it's no accident right now that there's a sort of an existential debate, fight, I should say, between someone like Mark Zuckerberg and Elizabeth Warren, because they are representing fundamentally different ways of looking at the world and managing the global economy. Facebook is kind of a supranational company, very much like a big bank. In some ways, the big tech companies are now the too big to fail banks. They're sort of in the same basket. Whereas politicians in countries that, like the US, like many parts of Europe, like most of the world, really, that have to deal with the problem of in-country inequality, have a very different set of problems that they have to deal with. And it's really important to understand that one of the things about capital flying over in the way that it has is that you can look on paper and say, all right, well, more prosperity has been created globally than ever before. But when you start to dig down into each individual countries, you see that inequality is growing in almost every country, except the countries that actually take an actively managed approach to sort of mitigating some of the problems of capitalism as we know it now.
Well, one of the most shocking statistics, in fact, in the film, I forget, one of the people you interview points it out, that in China, which does actually have some state management of the economy, that the average income in China since the 70s has increased by 800%. That's enormous. But the income of the richest 1% has increased by 2,000%. 2,000%. So, Suresh, I wanted to ask you, it was very difficult while watching, because I just watched the film yesterday, and we've been reporting on this incessantly, the protests all around the world, right, from Chile to Lebanon, etc., all of them driven, at least in part, by inequality and by perceptions of multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the policies that they've imposed. So can you talk about the particular form that inequality has taken, especially in the developing world, as this particular form of capitalism has been exported and implemented?
I can talk about it a bit. I mean, one of the things that you have, along with the same sort of pattern that you see in the U.S. and Europe, is again these globalization happens. You get all of these policies and all of these changes, and only a subset of people can benefit from them or really benefit from them a lot. And then the other benefits are either happen not at all or much less to the vast bulk of the population. And so then you sort of see that turns into a lot of conflict domestically, because some people at the top of the income distribution really do benefit a lot, and they want to keep that, and they want to sort of keep the promise that eventually this will get to everyone. And so, like, for example, in Chile, one of the things that it's just really about space and the privatization of the school system, and that people have these insanely long commutes, and public transit costs too much, and so it's very meat and potatoes kinds of issues around like their daily lives, but are kind of a manifestation of kind of all of the inequality producing policies that Chile has been kind of a poster child for a long time.
And Rana, actually, you talked about Google earlier, and we should all buy your most recent book, of course. But
thanks for the plug.
Facebook and Google. I mean, it's not just. I mean, can you talk about the specific implications for tax and tax evasion that tech companies like Facebook and Google present, as against older manufacturing and big industrial companies?
Yeah, so let me take that in two parts. First, the nature of these companies themselves, which we flicked at a little bit. If you look at the market cap of a Google or a Facebook or a WhatsApp, these are just as large as the previous generation of actually larger than the previous generation of tech companies, certainly than the big industrials of the past, the GMs, the GE, but they create far fewer jobs as a percentage of that market cap than those companies of the past. So you have this larger and larger pool of wealth, shrinking number of jobs. And so Ian, at the very end there, kind of got to that in his part. What are humans going to be left to do? Is it going to be the robots running everything? One thing that's important to mention, you can change that scenario if education keeps up with technological progress. But in the U.S., as in most developed countries, to a somewhat lesser extent, but primarily in the U.S., that link has been broken since the 1970s, in part because of all the things that Justin is showing us in this film. The wealth pie has been so much shifted towards the private sector. Tax offshoring is a big part of that. I mean, I find it just amazing that we so bought into the greed is good, trickle-down, neoliberal ethic that we didn't think to take, as a country, stakes in some of the biggest innovators, the new generation of tech companies, the Googles, the Apples, the Microsofts, the way that other countries would. Denmark, Israel, these countries take a stake. When taxpayers create innovation, they take a stake and they capture that wealth. But what happens in our system, which, as we know, has been exported to so many countries, that capital can fly abroad, not just to invest, but also to offshore taxes. So if you look at the last 10 years, most of the wealth that has been created since the smartphone really came onto the market in 2007, huge amount of wealth created, about $2 trillion in U.S. corporate profits offshored during that time. Most of them, the top 10 companies doing that offshoring, are those that are rich in data, intellectual property. That's all sitting in overseas bank accounts. And to the extent that it does come back, which this was one, if I can just make a small side note, this was one of the big myths of the Trump 2017 tax cuts. People were sold that, saying that companies, if we just lower tax rates, they're somehow going to bring back all that money, they're going to put it onto Main Street. Well, of the $2 trillion that was offshored, maybe $800 billion of it came back. The vast majority of that went straight into the markets, into stock buybacks, which are when a company buys up their own shares and that artificially jacks up the price, which benefits that sort of closed loop of financialization and trading. almost none of it went into the mainstream economy. And that's in part because companies care about bolstering profits for the quarter. They care about paying back shareholders. They really don't care much about labor. And labor has lost all of its bargaining power. And it will lose more still because of this technological disintermediation that's going higher and higher up the food chain, which is very Marxist, really. It's kind of the system, the system ultimately devouring itself in some way. And I think that that's really one of the profound things that your film gets at and that Thomas Piketty gets at.
And Justin, before we open it up to the audience, I wanted to ask, how did you decide who and what kinds of people to interview for the film? Because one of the people who really struck out was the psychologist, Paul something, who
Paul
does
Pitts,
that, who does that experiment and kind of explains this inexplicable sense of entitlement that the rich feel.
So Thomas and me both did a list, basically. I suggested some people, he suggested some people, and we sort of collaborated. Everybody, obviously both of you, got the Thomas tick. My biggest thing is I really wanted the people who talked in the film to be good storytellers. That was my number one. It's not just about being the expert. You have to be able to tell a story. Also, I wanted some diversity, and not just in terms of gender or race, but also in terms of political ideas. And that's why people like Francis Fukuyama came in, who was someone that even Thomas was surprised when he saw the film, the things that Francis was saying, those were the biggest criterias. And then obviously, it's a bit like herding cats when you're trying to put a shoot together and travel around the world, and so then it also became who can we actually get when we're in town,
So whose idea was the psychologist?
Oh, he was mine. He used. I've got a degree in psychology, so I like a psychologist in every film, because I think it's sort of that thing of how we tick. Everybody finds that fascinating. And Paul, I knew his Monopoly study. I'd read about it a lot. And by the way, that study has been peer-reviewed numerous times. This wasn't a one-off study. What you're seeing there is his video from his first study, but it has been replicated again and again and again. But Paul teaches Capital in the 21st Century. He basically studies the psychology of inequality, and he has numerous other experiments and things that are all fascinating about, rich cars on the road and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
Okay, so do we have microphones in the audience, or will people does anybody know? Microphones. Okay, so if you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand. I'll call on you. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself before you ask, that would be great. The woman in the middle.
Hi, my name is Allison. I'm an economic mobility researcher with the Boston Consulting Group. And my question is primarily for Rana, but would welcome other insights. If tech companies are now the too big to fail enterprises in our economy, then what does the financial collapse of data look like, and or what is that next crisis or breaking point as you see it? How will it manifest itself throughout the economy?
Yeah, I love this question because I almost feel like you could do a sequel, maybe teeing up your next film on that question. That is very much being debated right now. One of the things I was thinking of while I was watching the film is California, which is, of course, the birthplace of so many of the big tech companies that are holding, by the way, 80% of global wealth right now. 80% of global wealth is now living in the top 10% of firms that have the most data and IP. So there's now a big discussion underway, somewhat in Washington, very much in Brussels, about how to divide that pie up. Because if you think about data as this sort of new resource that is literally, forget about people in the strip mines. We are now the ore being mined. Our data, as we are surveilled, what Shoshana Zuboff, another great thinker on these topics, would call surveillance capitalism. That data is being mined. It's going to these companies as a natural resource that they don't have to pay anything for. So regulators are now saying, okay, that math doesn't work. You cannot, that puts all the problems that you've just seen in the last 90 minutes on steroids. So California is actually talking about something very interesting right now, a digital dividend, sort of thinking about, which is very similar to really what Piketty's wealth tax is all about. It's where does wealth live and how do you divide it more equitably? Well, when wealth is literally coming out of our brains via the patterns that we purchase online, our social media usage, our very thoughts in terms of what we search, then we need a stake in that. And so regulators are beginning to think about, should there be kind of a sovereign wealth fund for data, so that companies would have to give a percentage of their wealth into that fund, and then that would be divided up in however politicians see fit. But these entities are now, of course, the biggest lobbyists in the major capitals of the world, and there is a massive, massive pushback going on right now. There was actually a big, interesting piece in the New York Times about this. Amazingly, when it comes to protecting capital, people are quite willing to cross the bipartisan divide. So you'll find Google in bed with the Koch brothers, and it's really kind of amazing. And I think that this is going to be a huge election issue for 2020, and really a huge, probably signature political issue for the next 5-10 years.
Other questions? Please.
Sometimes I feel like as people come on and they talk about their money and their budgets, and I feel like I can tell people where to allocate their money, with their wants and their needs and everything. But sometimes I feel like it's also a little bit hopeless, like they're reorganizing their money when the deck is stacked so far against them. So it's interesting to look at this film from this global scale, but when it comes to people and their own money and their own world, in this really tiny way, do you have any thoughts on what I can tell people when they are trying to get ahead, kind of week to week? And how much can they save when they really can't save when the deck is stacked against them?
Well, one of the things that was most important that I wanted people to know was it's not your fault, and we had a screening in New Zealand, and a student came up afterwards and said that she'd been thinking so much about her sort of impending poverty of her life, and actually she felt more buoyant after watching this than less. But, I think one of the big things is conversation leads law change by about 2 decades, which is unfortunate as a lag. I mean, we can probably speed it up with the social media, but ultimately, it is the democracy question that's the biggest problem, and in the US, that is such a problem because of capital in democracy. In fact, capital works against democracy, and I think one of the most interesting things is that, now that we're looking at China, we used to think that capitalism and communism were opposites, but they're not at all. Communism and capitalism can work well together. Well, they are, in some ways, capitalism can actually be the deterrent of democracy, and I think that's the thing, that's the hurdle that's getting in front of everything, including solving climate change,
I also think it's one thing, it's not only that it's not your fault, it's also you can't solve it on your own. And so it's going to take getting together with someone, like everything from historically we've had unions, who knows what it looks like, or getting out to vote. It's like those are the kind of, it's got to be, they're going to be collective solutions, and it's not, it's hard to be a personal wealth manager and say, sorry, it's not something you can solve on your own, but that's kind of the place we're in.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Yandit. I'm a software engineer. And so there was this part in the documentary, and there was this quote from Piketty where he says that, well, if capital wasn't as concentrated, then it wouldn't be so bad, this transfer of power from labor to capital. And then the documentary focuses a lot about taxation and the importance of taxation, but it doesn't talk as much about how people get increased access to investment opportunities pertaining to capital. So taxation seems like one part of the coin, but you also need to figure out okay, given this redistribution afterwards, how do people get more access to productive capital investments? So I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts on or opinions on that.
Sure. I mean, one of the ideas is that actually most people shouldn't be investing, and with the idea that actually if you just had one of the things the wealth tax goes back into, right, is either a sovereign wealth fund. You could imagine the Social Security Trust Fund. You could imagine handing it out as a UBI. And the idea is that you kind of are just able to hold the broad stock of productive assets in society, and that gets paid out. And so that, you shouldn't be trying to like micromanage investment opportunities. You should be basically like having that done centrally, and then kind of take the proceeds and redistribute that around.
I would also add, I think we're actually at a tipping point where the whole consumer model, debt-driven model, investment-driven model may be changing. And I think we may be shifting and need to shift towards a more income, worker, labor-based model. And so to focus not so much on how can we have this broader distribution of equity shares. I mean, that's certainly an important step, but also how can we make sure that there is work for everyone? Because I don't believe, actually, I'm not a huge believer in the idea that universal basic income is going to be able to somehow put a blanket over everyone's problems. People need, they want work and meaning in their lives. And so I think making some different choices in that direction, again, more like the Germanic model, there are other models that have prioritized income over, say, asset growth. And I think that that's going to be a big shift. And you see that, it's interesting, you see it in a bipartisan way too. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, clearly on board with this, but Marco Rubio, interestingly, some of the new younger Republicans are saying, actually, this system is kind of tapped out. Maybe we are going to actually need to focus on jobs and income a little bit more. I also, just one more thing, I think we're going to get a major market correction at some point soon, and that this time around, because all the firepower that was used to kind of blanket the problems last time is gone, I think it is going to be a crisis moment that sort of refocuses people on, is this model fundamentally viable going forward?
I think we have time for one last question. Please, at the back.
Hi, my name is Juliet. I'm a student of PhD economics at Fordham University. I was wondering, there's a lot of ideas about refocusing the countries are focused on GDP growth as opposed to other types of development. Is there any other indicator that you would suggest to focus on instead of GDP?
Well, Joe Stiglitz, who's in the movie, is quite famous for thinking about wellness, GDP and different measures. I mean, he in a couple of his books, he makes terrific points about the very fact that the way you calculate GDP can be perverse. I mean, on the one hand, yes, you're calculating people's work and productivity. On the other hand, our prison system actually increases the GDP number in the U.S. The fact that France has to pay a lot of money into a national healthcare system, which actually makes people happier and healthier and increases productivity, brings down their GDP because it shifts wealth and it shifts the numbers around. So GDP is kind of whatever you think about it as being, how do you calculate it? It can be measured in many different ways, and I think we're moving beyond that, particularly in the digital era.
So let me qualify that. So actually, some of the research that Thomas and Gabriel, who's in the movie, and their co-author Emmanuel Saez have been doing, it's actually the idea of like let's not give up on GDP, but let's actually measure it over the whole distribution instead of just looking at the average. So they have these distributional accounts that's summarized in their new book, The Triumph of Injustice, which you should also all look at. But one of the takeaways of that is that if you wanted one kind of like nice summary measure, looking at medium, like bottom 50% income is like not bad, because you get kind of that's like the broad populations, the lower half, and it's like a summary measure of like how much of the growth is going to the bottom half of society, and that's like not a bad thing to like as a first pass.
Well, I'm afraid we're now out of time, so please join me in congratulating Justin and our panelists.